Hello and welcome to the screencast. I'm going to be covering the critical evaluation of sources today as part of your extended project. By now you will have put together a lot of notes on your chosen topic. And as I've shown in previous screencasts, the idea of those notes is to preserve the ideas, but also to put them into your own words as much as possible so as to avoid plagiarism. As we're reading, one of the key things is not simply to accept what we're reading, but to interrogate it and to decide its value. And that's why this key word of evaluation of sources is what this screencast is about. So by the end of the screencast, I'm hoping that you will be able to critically evaluate your sources and also to investigate the academic credentials of authors. And I'm going to be giving you all sorts of techniques in order to do this. Now, in terms of the EPQ and the assessment of the EPQ, I cannot emphasize enough how important this has been. In recent training that I completed with the AQA board, they spoke about this as the absolute gold standard of achieving either an A or an A star in the EPQ. So above all things will be to show that when you read, you interrogate, you evaluate, and you do not take the opinions of people at their word. So we will be covering passive and active reading. Passive being lazy reading, active reading being reading when your mind is truly engaged. We're going to be looking at how to challenge sources. So we're going to give you some strategies for looking at the sources and actually not accepting them. It's a terrible cliche that many people say, oh, I read it on the internet. Well, we know that 90% of things written on the internet is garbage. Now we're going to get the techniques that we need to actually understand that and how to analyze them. And we're going to be introduced to the CRAAP acronym. This is used by North American universities a great deal. I will cover the RAVEN acronym as well, which is used in Britain a lot more. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about peer review, what that means and why that is so important in academic research. And I'm going to end the screencast by looking at academic credentials, how we actually check up on a particular researcher or author and see that they have expertise. So how does learning actually happen? Well, we know that from thinking, not just doing things. So the key idea is that active critical reading will usually result in what we call conceptualized understanding, that we actually genuinely understand what we're reading. And today we're going to go one step further. We're not only going to focus on understanding, but we're going to be challenging and evaluating. And that's when learning is happening at its best. And to illustrate this, I'm going to introduce you to two avatars, two faceless avatars here. On my left, I have trusting Tom. Tom's a lovely lad, but he tends to believe everything that people tell him. And as a result of that, he does some foolish things and he gets himself into a lot of trouble by being so naive and gullible. And on my right, I have critical Claire. Critical Claire, on the other hand, is suspicious of what people tell her. She never trusts anybody. She always checks out their stories. Now, although critical Claire doesn't have many friends, she doesn't get herself into any academic trouble because she is always checking up on everything. So passive reading would be done by trusting Tom. Critical Claire, on the other hand, is a highly active reader who checks up. Now, employers and universities speak a great deal of critical thinking, and this is something that comes up in so many articles on education. Students cannot critically think, etc. Well, I think many students can critically think, but I just want to remind you of how important it is, not only in sixth form, but in your university applications in the future. This is what people are looking for. And we define critical thinking as the process of actively and skillfully, I like that word, conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating information to reach an answer or a conclusion. So if you do some of the techniques that we're going to be looking at today, you will most certainly be demonstrating critical thinking. So what is critical reading, and how do I know that I'm engaging in critical reading? Well, first of all, you're always asking yourself, why am I reading this? Why am I reading this? What do I want to get out of this? You want to identify the author's main ideas. You want to look at the context. Where was it written? Who wrote it? Who paid for the article? Who sponsored it, etc. And very importantly here on my right, analysis. What is my main opinion? What's my opinion of the main ideas? So that you're really engaging with the text and not accepting what it says. Now, I'm going to be playing an excellent video, and it's on the difference between non-critical and critical reading. It comes from a series called Critical Reading Bootcamp number 4. And I think you'll find this very useful indeed, and we'll sum it up afterwards.
The math and the writing sections are quite obvious as to what they're testing, right? There's a math in school and you do writing in classes. Whereas critical reading, it's not clear on the surface what that is. So what is critical reading? Well, it's probably best to oppose it to what we could call non-critical reading. So non-critical reading first is passive. What I mean by that is if you're reading non-critically, let's say you're reading a blog or a magazine or something, you're just kind of sitting there and you're kind of enjoying it. And if something's funny, you laugh, but you're not really engaging with it. You're not really doing anything with it. You're just kind of sitting there like you're watching a movie. Whereas critical reading is active. You're asking questions of it. You're underlining. You're trying to relate it to other things that you're reading or thinking about. So you're doing something with it. It's being active. Non-critical reading is really mostly concerned with the facts. What are the facts? What is true? Right, what does this passage say? It really pretty much takes what the passage says on face value, whatever it is you're reading. Whereas a critical reader would not only, of course, be interested in what is being said, that's of course critical and the foundation for everything, but how it's being said, so the techniques that are being used, rhetorical, literary devices, those kinds of issues, and then why it's being said, so what it means, right? So who cares that we were reading this, right? So a non-critical reader is only caring about the facts and what it says, whereas the critical reader wants to know not only what it says, but what it does and what it means. A non-critical reader is gullible, so sounds kind of negative, but basically if you're reading a newspaper story or you're reading a blog post or a magazine and you're reading it non-critically, you're generally going to accept whatever it is that the author is saying on face value, right? If you're just concerned with the facts, you're not really concerned with challenging those facts. You're just going to more or less believe what the author is saying. Whereas a critical reader is more skeptical. Doesn't mean you think that anyone you read is lying. It's just you always want to know, how did the author know this? How is the author arguing this? Is this actually true? What are the assumptions? Questions like that. So you're skeptical. You can eventually accept what they're saying is true, but you just don't off the bat say, oh yes, I believe everything you say. And finally, non-critical reading is reactive. In other words, like I mentioned before, if something's funny, you laugh. If something makes you sad, you cry. But you don't actually doing anything with it. Whereas in critical reading, you're being purposeful. You're not just reacting, you are acting. You want to know, what is this text saying? How does it relate? How could I answer questions with it? All those kinds of issues. So non-critical reading, or critical reading, can be really summarized by these three issues. The critical reader wants to know what the text says, what the text does, and what the text means. And I'm going to be referencing this a lot throughout the series. And finally, you can also break this down into a non-critical reader skims and a critical reader does close reading. And I'm actually going to have a video in a couple videos from now about this issue of skimming versus close reading. Now, to sum up, I think, what critical reading is ultimately. Critical reading is reading with a purpose. You are reading for a reason. And it's not a reason beyond, I want to have fun or for pleasure. It's reading to answer questions, to figure something out, to really engage with the text in a really meaningful way. And luckily for us, the purpose is given to us. In real life, it's a really open book, so to speak. But for the SAT, it's very, very narrowly defined. Your purpose is to answer particular questions they've given you, and that actually helps us out immensely.
Now, although that video is aimed at the SAT, that is standard practice within all academic reading. And that's very much what we want from you in this personal project, to get into the idea that there is a time for skim reading when you're reading quickly, but there's a time for close reading, and that's when you're reading like a detective. And to go back to my idea, we need you to be more like critical Claire than trusting Tom. Not to actually accept what people are saying on face value, but to believe that it is worth checking up and being suspicious. Now, to do this, I tend to, in my EPQ teaching, use the CRAAP acronym: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. And accompanying the screencast is a worksheet that shows you how to apply the CRAAP technique. You'll be able to put your research into a table and work out how far you can trust it. And that's the process of critical evaluation. Now, I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail, but first I'm going to show you a video from the Western libraries in the United States that gives details, a basic introduction to how to use the CRAAP acronym as critical evaluation.
If you want to succeed at your assignments or research, you should only use quality information, whether it's found in books, journal articles, or websites. Use the following criteria, also known as the CRAAP test, to critically evaluate any source of information. Currency. When was the information published, updated, and/or revised? Is the information out of date for the topic? Relevance, or intended audience. How much information is presented? Does it provide a superficial treatment or a detailed analysis? Is the information related and relevant to your topic? Is the readership level appropriate, neither too simple nor too sophisticated? Authority. Not all books or journal articles in an academic library are scholarly. Who are the authors and/or editors, and what are their credentials? For journals, are articles peer-reviewed? That is, do they have the approval of other experts in the field? For books, are they published by scholarly presses, popular presses, or self-published? Accuracy and verifiability. Does the source match your understanding of the topic? Can you verify the claims in other sources? Never rely on just one source. Is there a bibliography or list of works cited? What types of sources and how many relevant sources are cited? This is an indication of the depth of the author's knowledge. Purpose and objectivity. Is the purpose stated? Is the subject approached from an objective standpoint? If not, what is the author's bias and how might it influence the information presented? Be wary, there may be more than one perspective on any given issue. Using these criteria, currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose, to critically evaluate sources of information will help ensure that you're only using.
So I think that video by Western Libraries is a very competent overview of CRAAP, but it is somewhat rushed. Now, there are other techniques as well. I'm going to briefly touch upon those, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to look at the CRAAP acronym in a lot more detail and talk to you about how to apply it, because I think it will be new to most of you. Many of the concepts might be new. Now, in a lot of British schools, they teach the acronym RAVEN, and that stands for reputation, ability to see, vested interest, expertise, and neutrality. Another very good form of critical evaluation is by the desk history department, the idea of not TC, which those of you who take history will be familiar with, the idea of nature, origin, purpose, tone, and context. It doesn't really matter which technique you use. I tend to focus on the CRAAP technique because I have most of my resources on this. So let's have a look at it in more detail. Beginning with the idea of currency, well, the questions you need to ask yourself is, when was the information published or posted? Things quickly go out of date in the world of research, okay? Has it been revised or updated? That's the key idea. Is the information current or out of date? And if you're looking at a website, are the links functional? That's usually a good sign of whether the the articles are up to date or not, okay? In terms of relevance, does the information relate clearly to your topic? Who's the intended audience? Is it the right audience for a personal project or an EPQ report? Is the information of an appropriate level? Is it too easy? Is it too advanced? Have you looked at a variety of sources before determining that this is the one that you will look? Okay, so you need to look at a lot of them to see that this is the right one for your literature review. Would you be comfortable using this source for a research paper? Is it really academically respectable, in other words? Authority, and this is a continuation in some ways, but there are some differences. Who is the author? You need to do some investigation. Now, I'm going to be doing a lot more later in the screencast. Are the author's credentials or the organization affiliations given? Are they a PhD? Are they a medical doctor if they're writing about medical issues, etc., etc.? What are their qualifications? Have they advertised them? Do they check out as well? Because people are sometimes a bit naughty with lying about qualifications. Is there contact information such as a publisher or an email address? Okay. And you can also investigate the URL as I showed you in the Google Scholar screencast. Com stands for commercial, so there'd be a vested interest there. EDU and AU are educational. GOV is governmental. Org is a non-profit organization, and net is a network. So it really is worthwhile investigating the URL. Accuracy. Where does the information come from? Is the information supported by evidence? Has the information been reviewed or referenced? I'm going to talk a little bit more about peer review in a minute. Can you verify any of the information in another source? A great research skill is cross-referencing. Does the language or the tone seem biased? That's really interesting. Or is it free of emotion? Are there spelling, grammatical, or typographical errors? That's very disturbing, really, just going back to that quickly. If there are, you'll know that it's a little bit of a rubbish website and you should not be using it. Now, purpose. What's the purpose of the information? To inform, teach, sell, entertain? And this is where the idea of vested interest comes in. Do the authors or sponsors make their intentions or purposes clear? Is the information fact, opinion, or propaganda? Or I should have put there marketing, which is often used. For instance, if we find that there's a new study on climate change, and in fact they find out that the temperature is not rising like the President of the United States believes, and then we discover that this remarkable study was in fact sponsored by Texaco Oil Company. Do we believe that research, or are we feeling as though there might be a bit of a vested interest there, some bias, with some political bias in that case? Now, if you want some extension work, here's some excellent guides that will give you some more ideas about source evaluation, etc. But now I'm going to move on to the idea of peer review. Now, peer review within an academic context has a different idea from the idea of peer review like we have in desk. And it's very important that you know about this in terms of how it works in the academic world, okay? Now, have a little look at this cartoon. It tells you a lot here. Peer review. Here's the scientist with his paper, his research, and all of his colleagues are waiting to bash him over the head with different implements here. Most scientists regarded the new streamlined peer review process as quite an improvement. Now, it is meant to be a joke, but peer review is meant to be quite brutal. And the idea of peer review is that real experts look at your work and they try and take it apart. Now, it might sound cruel, but it's actually necessary in the academic world because, again, we need to be more like critical Claire and less like trusting Tom. So, I'm going to use the idea that I want you to be a kind of detective, a Sherlock Holmes person. And one of the things that you can do in terms of peer review is to find out everything you can about an academic's credentials. Now, why am I asking you to be so suspicious? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit in a moment that I'm doing a PhD at the moment, really struggling, and I've gone onto the internet and found out that it's quite easy to buy a PhD in all sorts of different areas. So a lot of people are not beyond cheating about their credentials and claiming degrees that they shouldn't have. And a lot of people write about all sorts of things that they shouldn't write about because they lack the knowledge and the expertise, and they lack the education in order to speak informatively about subjects. First thing is, this website here, ResearchGate, can be very useful to some of you. If anybody is a researcher of any kind, they should have a profile on ResearchGate. Not always, but in many cases. I thought I'd put this one on myself so that you could see that it looks at some of my former qualifications, etc., and it says what I am doing at the moment. So if you wanted to check an academic very quickly, you can go onto ResearchGate, and that is one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is simply Google them. This was a book that I chose because the vaccination debate in the United States at the moment is one that completely terrifies me. Some of you may be aware that millions of people believe that vaccinations are evil and that they cause things like autism. And this is a book that peddles this myth. It's written by a supposed doctor, and I would urge you to maybe have a look at it. I will include this web link for those of you who are interested, so you could have a look at it. You'll see it's filled with supposed scientific studies and graphs and all kinds of things. So it seems extremely convincing. So I wanted to be a detective. So what did I do? Well, I wanted to find out as much as I can. Now, the author of this book is Dr. Palmer. Very interesting looking at Dr. Palmer. He's a chiropractor. And he was in this spinal trauma center, and he's got all sorts of qualifications, it seems, on sports injuries, etc. But one of the things that you could do is find out that chiropractors are people who are not always accepted by the medical profession. In fact, many doctors think of them as complete frauds and quacks. So it's very interesting to Google up Dr. Palmer, and the more you read about him, the more you'll see that he's involved in various conspiracy theories. So this idea here of the book, that vaccination is such a terrible thing, it is very convincing when you read it. But when you act as a kind of detective and you start to critically evaluate his qualifications, etc., you might not believe Dr. Palmer as much as he would want you to. So I'm going to return to our two avatars. Trusting Tom, I think, would probably not vaccinate his kids. He would think to himself, this study is so convincing, it's got all this science in, and Dr. Palmer must be a great mind, because he is a doctor after all, and he's got all those graphs, and he's mentioned other people and studies, etc. I think of Critical Kate, I've changed her name from Critical Claire to Kate. Anyway, Critical Kate this time looks at the same study, and she looks at it really carefully. She finds out everything she can about Dr. Palmer, and she decides that she thinks that this book is actually not very good, not very credible. She finds out from other medical sources what is the consensus of most scientists. Now, I think you'll find nearly everybody in the medical profession would advocate that you have a vaccination. So Critical Kate gets her children vaccinated, and they do not fall prey to some hideous virulent diseases. So thinking about these two characters, as I said before, Trusting Tom might be a nice fellow, but he's not going to do very well in any kind of personal project or EPQ. Critical Kate may be seen as quite a nasty, suspicious person, but when we're doing academic research, we need to be suspicious. So, in summary, passive reading is easy, but it results in very low levels of understanding. There is a time to skim read when you are trying to cover lots of information fast, but when you discover information that you're going to use, you must read it critically, and you must learn to challenge the sources. We want you being Critical Kate / Critical Claire, not Trusting Tom. I've shown you today that the CRAAP technique is a very useful way of evaluating sources. It gives you a number of questions. It gives you a strategy. Now, I think sometimes for students, especially as you're only just finishing year 11 now, you may feel that it's not your job to criticize people who have far more academic qualifications than you. But I would urge you to feel as though you are entitled to question them and to challenge them. Peer review is very important. It means that respected academics have checked the quality of the research. In a previous screencast, I've looked at things like Google Scholar and JSTOR, in which the articles are peer-reviewed. And in the folder of resources, I've put another short video for you to look at if you're interested in the process of peer review. It shows how academics check each other's work and how this improves the authority of the article. And then towards the end, I try to show you that most researchers should have a biography on ResearchGate. And if failing that, you can Google them and find out everything that you can about them. This is a sign of being a detective. And academia and good, active, critical reading is about being a detective. Now, ideally, throughout the written report, or even the artifact report, you will be able to show these skills of critical analysis and evaluation throughout, and you will weave them into your arguments and into your literature review as much as possible. However, another important way of showing the examiner that you fulfilled the idea of critical evaluation is to attach a critical evaluation sheet in the appendices, which you would put alongside the production log. Now I have a picture here of Project Q to remind you that when you download your Project Q at the end and it becomes your production log, you have the opportunity to attach a number of things to it. The obvious one being is evidence of project planning. However, I've also seen some excellent projects that have attached evidence of critical evaluation in terms of note-taking, and you can do this. And how would this work? Well, here's an example of a student in the United States who has used the CRAAP table, currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose, and they've spoken about different websites that they've looked at. In this case, they've decided to give the source an overall score. Now, I probably would stop short of putting a numerical number on that because we both know that that's kind of arbitrary, doesn't really have any real justification in terms of numbers. But I think it would be very good to have an overall idea. And in this case, for instance, the student's written highly questionable source. Now, if you're reading, say, 20 or 30 sources, it's not practical to do this. However, if you were doing this for, say, up to 5 key sources, there's no reason why this particular sheet, the CRAAP sheet here, could be attached as an appendices to show just how detailed your critical analysis of the source was. Likewise, if you prefer to use the acronym RAVEN, here is a sheet which would give you the opportunity to interrogate the reputation, the ability to observe, the vested interest, the expertise, and the level of neutrality of the sources. And once again, you would then be able to give an overall rating to the source and attach that via Project Q or simply through your production log in order to show that you have all along been highly skeptical of sources and not simply taken them on surface value. Now, as I say, if you're able to interweave this into your essay, that is wonderful. But there is the possibility of using this appendices, and students often neglect this. All in all, the idea is that you become a detective of your sources, and therefore through both the essay, the report, and through the production log and your research journal, all of the time you show a highly evaluative mind, questioning the sources, looking at them from different points of view, interrogating them, looking at the academic credentials of the people in question. These are the skills that make an excellent researcher. So once again, I cannot emphasize enough. Place a great deal of emphasis on showing the examiner that you have critically evaluated your sources. Good luck with your notes, and I hope that you're able to use these techniques in both your reading and your analysis. Thank you for listening.